This is All India Radio. In the program Money Talk, now we bring you a discussion on decline in inflation and price rise under control. The participants are Sharad Kohli, economic analyst, and Nishit Kumar, AIR correspondent.
We are witnessing a drop in inflation over the previous month, primarily led by consumer price-led CPI. What factor, Sharadji, do you attribute to this fall?
Well, it's been a welcome relief for the country as a whole, not just for the government, but for the RBI and people, because it was hovering over 7% for a very long time. And I think that was also bothering the policy makers because it was forcing the RBI to increase the interest rates again and again. We've seen 190 basis points of interest hike, which we all know that if you go by principles of economics, it hurts the economic growth because the more the interest rate, you suck away the liquidity in the economy and, the whole process of growth slows down. So very, very welcome relief. And I think the first reason I would assign to is the seasonal impact because we were witnessing, abnormal kind of rain. We had extended monsoons, which was disrupting the supply of food because the inflation was primarily on account of food-driven items. When we talk of food, we are talking of vegetables, we are talking of fruits, we are talking of pulses, we are talking of cereals. So these were the items which were the main concern as far as the inflation is concerned. And as the monsoons moved away, the supply chains related to food, vegetables, they settled down. We saw the inflation coming down. The second main factor has been very rationalistic steps taken by the government. Amongst the main steps, I would say ban on export of wheat and food grains at a time when country needed them the most. Although India is a food surplus country, Prime Minister at the G20 summit spoke about India's food security, and I think the world looks at India as a food basket today. The world looks at India to supply food to them, not just to 140 crore people in India, but also to the rest of the world. So I think export ban during the time when there was a shortage here or the prices were rising because of the export, you do feel some supply crunch. So I think government stepped in at the right time and, halted the export of essential food grains. That was one. Second, I think the restrictions imposed on or the relief given on the imports on some of the stuff like edible oils which were being imported from abroad, I think they were contributing to the inflation because the high custom duty or whatever, which was making it expensive locally. So I think relief was given at the right time, which also contributed. And the third reason I would assign to is the crude oil, because we've seen crude oil shoot up to $120 per barrel at one point of time. And it came down to, it's been hovering between $90 and $100. I mean, sometimes when the OPEC decides to cut the supply, we see it getting closer to 100. And when we hear news about recession or when we hear news about lockdowns in China and so, we see it coming down. So basically hovering between 90. I won't say that crude oil has actually come low because our budgeted, rate at the time of economic survey was around $70, $75. It is much above that. But then relatively speaking, if you compare it to over the last few months, I think it has stabilized a bit, which has also contributed to settling down of the inflation. I would not take away any credit from the RBI's active role because RBI is hiking about 190 basis points across different monetary policy committee meetings has also contributed to controlling the inflation, even though the inflation was supply driven. So typically in a supply driven inflation, the impact of interest rate hike is not as much as it is in the case of demand-driven inflation. Because this was supply-driven, but RBI did play its role because there is a certain component of demand as well. So I think these 4 or 5 factors have contributed in inflation settling down.
Food inflation, Sharadji, it roughly accounts for nearly 40% of the CPI basket. And it has, obviously it has cooled down a bit, as you said. So do you see it falling down any further with a late resurgent monsoon and a good harvest anticipated?
I would say that the declining process or the declining scale of inflation has started. I think it must have touched its peak, 7.4%, which we saw last month. I think to my mind it was peak. And, as an economist, as an economic analyst, I could see it coming down because what I think our listeners need to know is that when the wholesale price index is lower, the impact on the consumer price index is felt some time after. Let's not forget wholesale and consumer is a supply chain process. First, the goods reach from the factory to the wholesalers. And then from the wholesalers, they reach through the distributors to the retailers, and then from retailers to the consumers. So every time wholesale price index in a particular month is lower and the consumer price index is higher, you can easily forecast that in the coming month, the impact of lower wholesale price index, that is the WPI, will be transported or will be transmitted to the retail price index, or the CPI as we commonly call it. So I think it was in the offing, I would say, when we saw a lower WPI last month. So one could visualize, and that is how, the governor of RBI, Shaktikant Das, also said, even before the CPI numbers came, he said that we are going to definitely see lower CPI numbers this time because the wholesale price index was indicating. And this time around, when we got the recent numbers of 6.77 for the CPI and a little over 8% for WPI. So I can easily say that in the coming months, you will see the CPI coming down further. But obviously, it will be subject to other factors. We are witnessing a very volatile geopolitical situation as of now. We've seen tensions around China and Taiwan. The Russian-Ukraine conflict is by no means over. Because if any of these things, they escalate, obviously, any distance in the geopolitical situation also disrupts the supply chain. And, let's not forget that the cause of inflation, apart from COVID, was the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So, on the boundaries of Europe, so the entire world supply chain been disrupted and inflation becoming a cause of concern across the world. So that is what I meant by geopolitical concerns, that if any escalation happens, but if things remain constant, if things remain the way they are today, there is a G20 summit going on right now as we talk, and there's a lot of peace talk going on there. Efforts are being made to diffuse this tension. Our Prime Minister, Honorable Shri Narendra Modi, has made an appeal to Russia and Ukraine to settle down this war, to end this war. So I think if these efforts yield and status remains the same or gets better, there is no doubt that inflation will come down further in the months to come, Nishant.
Assuming that we are past the peak of COVID, of course, there will be variants coming here and there in between. And the global commodity prices have also kind of eased a bit. So how much of an effect do you see of this impacting inflation here?
Well, if you see the factors behind the recent CPI data, we saw cooling down of steel prices, we saw cooling down of the iron ore prices, we saw a little bit of relief on the energy prices, not much, but little bit of relief on the energy front also, which is a constituent of the WPI. In the CPI, it may not be a big constituent, and our listeners must remember that the composition of the wholesale price index basket and the composition of the consumer price index basket is slightly different. They are not identical, even though a fall in WPI has an effect on CPI, but the composition of the baskets is different. So I think settling down of the commodity prices around the world have also contributed, because that's where the industrial output matters. And that's where the cost of production as far as the manufacturing matters, because take, for example, automobiles. We were witnessing escalation in prices of manufacture of, let's say, passenger cars and commercial vehicles, because the prices of steel, the prices of other products related to automobile industry were going up without any, I would say, relief. And I think that was adding to the prices every now and then, when people are complaining every time we go and buy a car, we find that the prices are up, the prices are no more the same. And, we saw Diwali recently, we saw the festive season, where the buying or the consumer confidence was good, but it was hampered to a certain extent because of the high commodity price. So I think that the commodity prices also declining or settling down or cooling off, I would say. I won't say declining, I would say they've been cooling off. So if they cool off further, I think you can expect an all-round relief. So whereas a relief on the food, vegetable, pulses, cereal front, the second relief will come by way of the commodity prices, particularly the metal prices. But having said that, I would like to add here that the crude oil prices will have a very important role to play here, because crude oil is something which is not in the hands of the policymakers in India. 86% of our crude requirements are being sourced from abroad. That is, we are dependent on imports for 86% of crude oil requirements, which means that if crude oil prices fluctuate or if they go beyond $100, we will again witness pressure, because crude oil, we should not forget, has a cascading effect on inflation, on the CPI. It has a rippling effect, because it adds to the cost of everything. The cost of transportation goes up, it adds to the cost of, and we saw that happening in the last 1 year. Basically, inflation has been driven by the crude oil prices, apart from the edible oils, apart from the other products, but crude oil has been a big contributor to the inflation. So we will have to assume and presume that crude oil prices do not shoot up from here. And the reason why crude oil prices should remain low should not be recession. We should also keep that in mind, because because of recessionary trends in the world, if we see crude oil prices going down, that's our export. The demand may come. I think if the crude oil prices remain $90 or maybe it come down below $90, you will see further decline of inflation, Nishit, in the times to come.
Sharadji, now with inflation easing a bit, but not yet within the comfort zone for the central bank, how do you see the RBI reacting to it when it meets in the next MPC?
Well, I think as far as RBI's hawkish stance, that is more called although the RBI governor in his one of his earlier speeches said that, this term dovish and hawkish is not coming from RBI. This is a term being used by the analysts, by the experts to understand it better. So I think the hawkish stance will continue. I really don't think that you can expect a no rate hike in the forthcoming Monetary Policy Committee meeting. You will still witness maybe a moderate hike. If it's not 50 basis points, maybe 25 basis points or 35 basis points, because let's not forget that inflation is still beyond the tolerance level of RBI. I mean, the tolerance level of RBI is between 2 and 6%.
Correct.
But with inflation cooling down, even in highly developed part of the world like America, I think you can expect RBI to be having a more moderate approach, and we might witness RBI taking a little more liberal approach and being a little moderate in the hike, although it was 6.77% or 6.8% CPI is definitely not in the comfort zone, and RBI would like to see that this should come down below 6%. And the RBI has said that in the forthcoming fiscal year, that is in the fiscal year 23-24, the governor said that he sees the inflation hovering around 5%. So to be able to reach that target, I think RBI will have to continue, hike the interest rates, maybe at a lesser rate of 25 to 35 basic points in the next one or two Monetary Policy Committee meetings. Thereafter, we might see a no situation, and a fall in the interest rate is still a distant dream. I think nobody should expect that the interest rates would start falling from here. I think that seems some distance away. All said and done, I think I would expect a very moderate hike in the forthcoming MPC by RBI.
Sharadji, with the cooling down in the inflationary pressure, can we expect to see the results in real terms on the ground level beyond, of course, the figures and statistics?
Well, I think interest rate dropping or interest rate hikes slowing down, if I use the right terminology here, interest rates slowing down will boost capital investments, because the corporates, the industry was complaining that the cost of borrowing has gone up, so they were not able to expand, they were not able to add to their production capacities, they were not able to set up new businesses. It impacts the startups also, it impacts MSMEs, it impacts all the businesses across the board. So I think with the interest rate hike slowing down, I think the industry would be encouraged to do more investment, industry would be encouraged to borrow more, and we should not forget a very important aspect of slowing down of the interest rate hikes is the consumer confidence, because nowadays I think the entire consumer world is driven by interest rates. You buy a refrigerator, you buy a car, you buy a house, people fund their holidays, people fund their education. So with all these things becoming less expensive because of moderate rate hikes, I think the consumer confidence will come back, which will in turn have an impact, a positive impact rather, on the demand. And with the demand picking up, I think the capital formation process would speed up, which will boost employment. I think unemployment is one big problem for our country since independence. And I think more employment generation means it will have a chain reaction wherein it will boost more demand, and I think it will overall bring prosperity to the economy.
Very briefly, Sharadji, can we safely say that we have seen the peak of inflation, and if everything continues the way it is at the moment, we'll see better times?
Well, as I said earlier, fingers crossed, the way things are going right now, it seems that we have crossed the mountain. We've crossed the peak 7.4%, which we saw last month, which was CPI. I think it's coming down from there should be good news. But as I said, things are very dynamic as of now. There are two riders to the statement that we've seen the peak. First rider would be that the geopolitical situation should remain constant, should remain the way it is. That is, if I put it in simpler words, peace should prevail around the world. That is the first rider. My second rider is that the crude oil prices must remain under control. So if these two important factors, they remain under control, that is peace in the world and crude oil prices remaining low, I don't see any reason why we have crossed the peak, and I think inflation would further cool down from where we are right now.
Thank you so much, Sharadji, for having shed light on inflation, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on decline in inflation and price rise under control. The participants were Sharad Kohli, economic analyst, and Nishit Kumar, AIR correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.